Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This week's new book author guest is Bryan Walsh. He is the author of the new book, End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World, Asteroids, Supervolcanoes, Rogue Robots, and more. Bryan is a graduate of Princeton University and was a Time correspondent, Time Magazine foreign correspondent for 15 years. He founded the award-winning Ecocentric blog on time.com and has reported from more than 20 countries on science and environmental stories like SARS, global warming, and extinction. He lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife and son. He covers all the great end times existential threats, asteroids, volcanoes, nuclear weapons, climate change, disease, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, aliens, and then surviving the day after one of these extinction events, and then his collective overview at the end. It's a great book. I listened to it on audio, and it's like a Stephen King thriller, except these actually could happen. Anyway, I'm, as you'll note at the beginning of the podcast, I'm a little skeptical of some of the doomsday scenarios in as much as they may not cause our total extinction. But as we discuss, wiping out half of humanity or even 10% of humanity would be catastrophic enough. We should do something about these. So in addition to all those, we also look into the details of each of them, particularly the human-caused ones. I'm interested in nuclear weapons, climate change, and AI as a existential threat. So we look at both the doomsayer side and the skeptical of doomsayer side, and then kind of reflect at the end what it all means. So as always, if you enjoy the podcast and would like to support it, we appreciate that. We need that. It's part of the Skeptic Society educational mission. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization, so you can support it and the podcast at skeptic.com/donate or through Patreon. Thanks for listening. Good. Bryan Walsh, welcome to the podcast. Congratulations on the new book. We will release this the day it comes out. End Times, A Brief Guide to the End of the World. Asteroids, supervolcanoes, rogue robots, and more. I love that title. And in fact, you cover asteroids, volcanoes, nuclear weapons, climate change, disease, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, aliens. So that's enough to cover a good hour going through all this stuff. I loved the book. I listened to it on audio. And,
great.
Yeah, no, it's like a gripping novel. It's like a Stephen King, novel, except it could actually happen. And I've been interested in this subject since really I was in college. I was a born again Christian, and when I was an undergraduate, Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, was the best-selling book in America for like the entire decade. It was unbelievable, and we used to read the newspaper basically to see how much current events were matching the countdown to the end times and when it was all going to start. Of course, then I became an atheist and I realized I was hoodwinked on all that. So I didn't revisit this topic really until the late 90s when the idea of existential threats and that sort of thing, mainly with climate change. Nuclear weapons had always been there, but mainly climate change kind of came onto the radar. And although, see, even there, because I kind of got hoodwinked with the Christian versions of the end times. And then in the 70s, in the 80s, when the ecological movement was started, there were a lot of doomsday predictions. By the peak oil, we're going to run out of gas. The rainforest would all be gone by the 90s. And Paul Ehrlich made his famous predictions about population, and he made that bet with the economist Julian Simon about the cost of precious metals as they decrease in quantity, and the price would increase, but it didn't. And so then by the 2000s, when Al Gore came on the scene, and he convinced me that climate change is real and human caused, but I was still not sold on the doomsday idea. This is all going to lead to this. But now that I've read your book, I'm coming back around like, okay, we could be screwed. So,
well, that's the idea. So, yeah.
So give us a little background. You were a Time Magazine journalist for 15 years, which explains why you're such a good writer. But you left 2 years ago to write the book, and are you still doing journalism work?
I am, yeah. Actually, I'm currently editing a publication called 10, which is part of a whole series of publications Medium has launched. Right. They're known as a blogging platform, but over the last about year and a half, they've started launching sort of This one's a science and tech publication, a few others in politics and for people of color, things like that. And that's how I've been sort of keeping myself busy the last few months since I finished the work of the book, both writing for that and now doing a lot of just work promoting this book.
Yeah. So your entree into it was your stories for Time on some of these plagues like SARS. I love that opening story when of your covering that when you were, I forget what country you were in.
That was Hong Kong, yeah.
Yeah, in Hong Kong. Yeah, that's right, Hong Kong. And that must have been scary as shit. Like, this could actually happen.
Yeah, that's exactly how it felt. And I describe in that chapter, it was a strange time because it was the spring of 2003. So the real focus of the news at that point was the war in Iraq, whereas those of us over in China and Asia were kind of on the outside of that story. And then suddenly we started hearing reports about these strange respiratory illnesses across the border in Guangdong. And we just followed it up. And then within really about a month, you started having cases popping up in Hong Kong and then in Vietnam and Singapore. And it just sort of growing until the WHO was declaring it a global emergency. And I had left to go home for a short stint, actually, a friend's wedding. I came back. And suddenly, I see everyone wearing surgical masks because they're worried about getting infected. Yeah. I see on the front page of the newspaper that the head of the Hong Kong Hospital Authority had been infected with SARS. And suddenly I was really like, oh my God, this is actually incredibly real. And we had no idea where it was going to go. There was no sense they hadn't found the virus yet. They didn't know the cause. Didn't really know how to treat it. It seemed to be spreading into the public, which was really scary because it started out in hospitals. And yeah, I had a moment where I was just like, is this it? Is this how it's going to happen? Thousands of miles away from home, no idea what's going on. But that sort of inspired me to really get into writing about science, and in a way was kind of the lodestone for the rest of this book.
Reading that chapter reminded me of that movie, Outbreak, the Dustin Hoffman movie. Well, everybody was in that movie. But it really showed how that could unfold. And it seems like, reading your stuff, like, yeah, that actually could happen, but it hasn't happened. Why has it not happened?
Well, it seems like disease is an interesting subject when it comes to existential risk, because on one hand, disease has killed far more human beings than anything else, more than war, more than any kind of natural disaster. But there seems to be a limit that evolution puts on any kind of virus or bacteria or any other sort of organism that would come out of evolution. And that's because something can only be so contagious or so virulent. If it's too virulent, something like Ebola, for instance, which tends to kill very quickly when it infects someone, it knocks the host out so quickly they can't really spread it that quickly, so it's limited in that way. Those viruses that tend to be more contagious, something, say, like measles, for instance, which are really contagious, tend not to be that virulent. I mean, that's part of what allows them to spread. So you're unlikely to get the kind of a virus that would somehow be some kind of doomsday combination of incredibly virulent and incredibly contagious. So while, disease will remain a problem, it's not likely, barring some out of book scientific theory, for it to really threaten kind of extinction in that way. If you look at really even things that have caused certain animal species to go extinct, disease is almost never the cause. Usually that only happens if you're talking about like an isolated island where, it's easy to run out of hosts. But globally, that seems to be the case, which is good luck for us.
Parenthetically, do you ever worry about the anti-vaxxers, or is that going to be a minor blip?
I think the anti-vaxxers are very important. I think less in terms of what they're doing now, because at the end of the day, most people are still getting vaccinated. We're talking about diseases like the measles that can be dangerous to some people, but ultimately aren't major threats. What worries me about that is more what it says in terms of how we would respond to a real unprecedented unknown crisis. Even if you took something like SARS again, SARS took place in 2003 at a time when there was significantly more trust, I think, in the government, for instance, than there is now. I could imagine a situation now where you have something very similar. An unknown virus starts spreading. People simply don't listen to the government. Perhaps, the government doesn't choose to listen to his own scientists. And that's very dangerous, because if you get into that, then it really cripples the ability to respond to any kind of public disease. And you get in a situation where things will get much worse than they really should be.
When the president has 63 million people he can tweet to at any moment, 24/7, and claim that X is a Chinese hoax. And people believe it. I mean, I don't know what percentage, but it's a big enough percentage. It's disconcerting.
And in a case like when it comes to herd immunity, you need as many people to follow as possible. So it doesn't take you don't need half the country to really ignore that kind of advice. You just need a small percentage, and something like that can keep spreading and keep spreading.
Yeah, herd immunity. It's 5 to 10%, depending on the disease.
Usually.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are pockets in California, Oregon, Colorado that have already breached the herd immunity and are seeing some of these revival of some of these communicable diseases.
We've had a same serious problem in parts of New York and outside the city as well, again, where it's sort of isolated communities that just have very high anti-vax rates, and it does have an impact, especially, of course, as you know, if you have a child, for instance, who's immunocompromised, they can't take that vaccine, so they really depend on the rest of us to do what's right.
Where do you live?
I live in Brooklyn.
Oh, Brooklyn. And you have a young child, right? I think you dedicated the book to your...
I do, yeah. A 2-year-old son named Ronan, who was born about 6 months after I started working on the book, and I wrote about him in the book, talking about how he really, and it's a bit cliched maybe to say this, but he really did, his existence gave me a stake in the future in a way that I didn't really have before. I used to write about climate change for years and years, and that was important, and that was about the future of the planet, but it's not the same as having something on the line in that way, which isn't to say that you need to have children to feel that way, but for me, it really did put the pedal to the metal in that way. And the fact that it was happening at the same time I'm working on this book, all these incredibly scary things, I think it just acted as this sort of accelerant around both understanding how much is at stake when we really talk about the world here. It's not just about us, all 7.7 billion people on the planet now. It's really about, those billions and billions, maybe even trillions of people who could live in the future, provided we don't screw it up here. So like his existence really gave me that kind of that connection in a way that I didn't have before.
I felt that way after becoming a parent. I think that's probably true for most. But it makes it visceral instead of a intellectual exercise in expanding the moral sphere to include future generations. It's like, that's my kid.
Right. And, it really does kind of bring it home.
Yeah. Now, so this term existential risk, that's become popular maybe in the last decade or so. That's now something of an intellectual activity, right? An academic field of study, existential risks.
Oh, absolutely. There's several academic institutions, most of them sort of in Britain, in Oxford and Cambridge, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, the Future of Humanity Institute. Here in the United States at MIT is the Future of Life Institute. There's a few other smaller ones as well. And it's really, it's what's happened is that people kind of looked around, and we always knew that there was a study of catastrophes and there was always concern in that way, but there was no attempt really to academically bring all those together and see there's a connection between something that could destroy the world naturally versus something that could destroy the world that's made by human beings, and really begin to look at it. I mean, Nick Bostrom, who is at the Future of Humanity Institute, who was kind of like the dean of this field of study, I'd say, wrote a few papers about 10 years ago where he really noted that incredibly little work had actually been done on this subject. Just considering it's really literally about the future of humanity and whether it has a future. There had been more studies done on the dung beetle, for instance, than existential risk at the time he was writing that. Right. I doubt that's the case now. It seems like it's caught up somewhat, but it really did drive home that it hadn't been taken seriously in that kind of way. And if you began to sort of develop a science that could look at it in a broad sense, see what these issues had in common, you could really begin to sort of maybe weigh them, sort of see which one is more important, which one's less. And I think most importantly, really sort of begin to understand what can we do, what can we get the most, whether it's our philanthropic dollar, it's our research attention, to preserve the future of humanity. So that was an ability to really understand that.
So by existential risk, what they mean is the actual extinction of Homo sapiens, if not all life on Earth.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it can expand depending on how you want to look at it to be catastrophic, meaning imagine, the loss of most of humanity. Imagine a situation where there are a few remnants left, but they're the future of that species is completely damaged for all time. It doesn't have to necessarily get to every human being on the planet. That's actually quite difficult to do, barring some really big catastrophes. But it is that's much worse than anything we've ever encountered before. You can imagine the worst things that have happened to humanity: World War II, the Black Death, anything along the worst earthquake, the worst hurricane. We're talking about things that are orders of magnitude worse than that.
Yeah. In terms of existential risk as the total extinction, I don't like that because, if it's half of humanity, that's bad enough. Or even 10% would be, catastrophic enough. We should be focused on it, because you could always argue, well, look, we could survive a nuclear exchange. Maybe 10% of humanity is left, and so we're okay. We don't have to really worry about this. No, actually, 90% would be really, really not fun.
That is absolutely true. I mean, it's far beyond anything we can even possibly imagine. It's like at most you've seen, epidemics that might have killed 10% of the global population. Nothing along the lines of what we're talking about here. Although it is interesting to note, I mean, there's an Oxford ethicist who's now passed away, Derek Parfit, who had a famous example where he really tried to get it. Yes, it's incredibly important, obviously, what happens to us here, in part because it is us. But when you really think about, okay, what if we're around for another 1,000 years? You're talking about tens, hundreds of billions, trillions of people, perhaps. It's actually worse. It's like, if you look at, like, all right, let's imagine 99% of people, 99, are, made extinct through a nuclear exchange. What's worse, like 0 to 99, like nothing, or to 99, or the difference between 99 and 100? And his argument was, as bad and as unimaginably awful as losing 99% of humanity would be, the difference between that last percent is actually greater than everything that came before. Because you're talking about orders of magnitude more people who would be lost, who just would never be born because the species is kaput.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of that scene in Dr. Strangelove where George C. Scott is trying to convince the president that a nuclear exchange wouldn't be that bad. And he says, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but, 30, 40 million tops, depending on the weather conditions.
Exactly. That's Herman Kahn's old line. Yeah,
Herman Kahn's. But that was true. And Stanley Kubrick was a student of that whole mutual
tragic but distinguishable post-war states. Absolutely.
And then last year I read what's his name? The Doomsday Machine, Ellsberg's book.
Yes.
Which is amazing to me. It took him so long to bring that out because these are notes from the late 50s, early 60s when he worked for the Kennedy administration and then the Rand Corporation about the real numbers the government was talking about losing as tolerable.
Right.
100 million Americans, 100 million Russians. Just like, well, these are just numbers.
Oh, and I actually talked to him for the book, and
right.
I asked him all about that. And part of the reason I think it didn't come out for a long time is he actually had lost the papers. Famously, he took them
right.
while he was doing the Pentagon Papers, and he knew that, look, as much trouble as he was in for the Pentagon Papers, the idea of stealing the nuclear war plans of the United States, or far worse when it comes to what that would have meant for him as a criminal penalty. And so we actually sent that to his brother upstate in New York. The brother hit it, and then there was a hurricane, ironically, that washed it all away. So it was lost, which bad for history, good for Ellsberg probably, because he would have been in even more trouble than he was otherwise. And then I think it just took him time really to focus on this and actually reconstruct it, and then write this once he'd really come to focus his career on trying to spend that last few years of his life really warning people about the dangers of nuclear war, which had been forgotten, I think, after the end of the Cold War. And only now we're beginning to realize, hey, this is still real. Those missiles are still there, and they could still kill us.
Yeah, even though we've reduced by something like 87% the total nuclear stockpile, there's enough left to still cause one of these existential events if there was just a single exchange between the Russia and the United States. Mm-hmm. And, of course, with Trump and Kim Jong-un swapping tweets or love letters or whatever they're doing, it has kind of brought it back to the forefront. And, now Trump wants to spend, billions of dollars to re-up the technology because he saw a 60 Minutes episode. I remember that episode where they showed that they're still using these big floppy disks from the early 80s.
Right.
And true, it should be updated. But how about a better idea? Just scrap it all together. Well, so how do we get to nuclear zero given the other guy problem? That is, I would do it, but the other guys I don't trust.
Right. It's incredibly difficult, and I understand the logic behind, all right, we need to update this system, and in part because the scariest thing about nuclear weapons is really not the idea that someone's going to set them off on purpose. It's the idea that they're going to happen accidentally. That happened several times almost throughout the Cold War, and it could still happen again now. So I definitely update those computer programs so we're no longer running like Windows 91. But at the same time, one thing the Trump administration did, I think just a couple of weeks ago actually, was they withdrew from the intermediate missile ban. And that, to me, they had political reasons to do that because the Russians were, quite honestly, cheating on that treaty. But the idea of systematically, unilaterally pulling out, that's not going to help. That's going to create more risk. Yeah. And just a president and an administration that just seems allergic to the idea of the hard work of diplomacy, which is how we reduced those nuclear warheads by 87%. That's how we did it. It took years. It took a lot of trust, took a lot of work. It took a lot of back and forth. No one seems to want to do that, and that's what really concerns me. So now you're putting new missiles on the ground. They're moving faster. They're closer. And that, again, raises the chance that either someone might actually try to use them on purpose, or just they could make a mistake, think something's happening when it's not, and next thing you have, thousands of warheads flying in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, like the Soviet submarine commander during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he was on his own and could have launched and didn't. There's actually a Netflix documentary you can watch, The Man Who Saved the World, I think it's called. And where they visit him now. He's an old guy now, and it's not that good of a documentary. He's sort of a grumpy old guy, so it was hard to get much information out of him. But the point that he could have done it, just one guy, and we just sort of looked out.
It's quite frightening. I mean, that guy Vasily Arkhipov. I mean,
that's it. Yeah.
There's a room named after him at the Future of Humanity Institute.
Oh, is that right?
They recognize this guy should be on stamps. He had a moment of bravery, stood up to his own commander really, and said, "No, we can't do this." And if he had not, I don't know. It's easy to see that situation of all situations very quickly spinning out of control, and we would have a very different, may not have a world now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sanctions seem to work pretty good, but not that well. Not enough to get rid of all nuclear weapons, other nuclear states, for example, North Korea, possibly Iran if they get there. From Kim Jong-un's perspective, I could see why he'd want nukes. First of all, you get a chair at the big table with the big boys.
Sure.
Other world leaders answer your mail, and the United States doesn't fuck with you. They might economically, but they won't militarily, whereas we do intervene in other people's affairs militarily all the time. So, trying to take a non-American perspective, I can, sort of see, I can see why they would want to do that, even if it bankrupts the country. But that's what dictatorships do.
Oh, yeah, I would. I mean, look, I think it's been obvious to any world leader since 2003 and Saddam Hussein that the best way to not get invaded by the United States is to have nuclear weapons. North Korea, in all honesty, kind of has that already. I mean, they, even without a nuclear bomb, they still have the ability to essentially destroy Seoul and much of South Korea using conventional weapons. They always had that gun pressed against, South Korea's temple, and therefore the United States to a certain extent. But having the ability to actually put a nuclear missile somewhere in American territory is a very different story. And that is an element of insurance. And in the past, that would have meant they were essentially cut off from global trade, cut off from the international community. President Trump seems to be actually quite fine with that not being the case.
Yeah.
And it's truly strange. It's one of the odder of many odd things he's done. That is truly something I can't quite wrap my head around.
Well, I don't think anybody can because he's so unpredictable. And I, certainly trust someone like Obama, who got the Nobel Peace Prize for, really his projected influence on, nuclear tensions. But he wasn't really able to do all that much.
No, he was very much not able to do that. And I bet if you were to ask him now, it'll be interesting to see what he writes in his memoir. But I would bet that one of his great regrets is that he wasn't really able to move much on that. He obviously the Iran nuclear treaty would have been I think a big difference maker had it not been followed by Trump and essentially tearing that up. But at the end of the day, he didn't really succeed in changing the American first use policy. He wasn't able to reduce, the dependence on land-based missiles, which is a real threat because those ones have to be used or lose. So, if you have those coming, if you think there's an attack coming, you fire off those land-based missiles because if you don't, they'll be destroyed. Whereas the submarine missiles or bombers can kind of be recalled or they're not at risk of being destroyed in the same way. And at the end of the day, he didn't really leave this country any safer, especially once the treaty was ripped up on nuclear weapons than he did when he came in.
Yeah. On Iran, are you worried that they could get there, or do you think Israel would put a stop to it before that would ever happen?
I am worried that they could get there. I think they're still negotiable. I think they may be biding their time to see what's going to happen in 2020. If Trump is replaced by a Democrat, that would change, I imagine, the board on negotiations. If he is reelected, though, then I really wonder. I think there is a good chance they could go down that road. I don't think the Israelis would let them, but at the same time, it's not like 1981 again. It's not like this could be destroyed or, shut off just based off a single strike by whether Israel or the United States. So you're then entering a period of real danger because then you're going to see American allies like Saudi Arabia pushing to get nuclear weapons. Suddenly, that nuclear club grows from about 9 countries now to, who knows, 10, 11, 12, 13. It grows like dominoes. And the more countries that have those weapons, the more danger we're in because it puts that power in more leaders' hands, and that increases the chance that something goes wrong.
Is there any doubt that the Stuxnet virus was a covert operation by the United States to stop Iran from?
My understanding is there's very little doubt on that.
Yeah, okay, right. I figured.
Which is, and I should say that's kind of interesting because it also opens up another door, which is the use of these kind of programs as weapons. And once, we know this based off the history of weapons and even nuclear weapons themselves. Once you start using it, whether it's the United States or another country, you push other countries to develop countermeasures, and then you create essentially an arms race around this. Now, That's what you have. North Korea, a country with where people are in destitute poverty, can produce programmers who can really put both the U.S. government and U.S. commercial interests at risk, as we saw with the Sony hack. Obviously, the Russians can do that. The Iranians can do it increasingly. Suddenly, you have a world where no one really has any regulations and laws around cyber weapons, and that's going to get very concerning. To connect it to the AI question, which is a separate part of this book, that's really worrying because that creates a whole new field of warfare where there are no rules, where we don't know how to respond. If, for instance, the U.S. were to be hit by a really crippling cyber attack, let's imagine something on the power grid, for instance, where people really died, and you think you can trace it back to Iran, for instance. What do? Do you respond with nuclear weapons? That's not an open option, So that's very concerning. And right now we're in a situation, it's almost like, I want to say 1946, 1952, whenever, the first time you had two countries with nuclear weapons, no arms treaties, no rules around how to use these. That's pretty scary.
Yeah. Well, I think that's in part why the doomsday clock is set at 2 minutes to midnight at 11:50. Two and a half minutes. Yeah. I always find that something of a press gimmick, media attention kind of thing. I suppose it has a useful function of getting us to think about these things, but really it's no better than it was right in the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I have a hard time. Actually, it's closer than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, according to them. I think the last time it was this close was actually right after the Soviets dropped their first H-bomb, which was a very dangerous time. I would definitely not like to trade places. On the other hand, back then you didn't have the same threat around things like climate change. You didn't have the same threat around things like biotechnology. So if a few other additional risks that might add on to that to a sense, but I'm pretty sure the world was in a lot more threat, in 1953 than it is now.
So we've done disease, nukes, and you segged into AI. Now, of course, the Future of Life, the Future of Humanity Institute and the Future of Life Institute, whatever they're called, they're not thinking about Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator when they're thinking about AI threats.
No, they hate the Terminator. Yeah. There's nothing that can annoy them more than if you ask them about the Terminator.
Right.
No, it's not. You're talking about the risk from artificial intelligence. It is almost certainly not going to take the form of Arnold Schwarzenegger being sent back in time in cyborg fashion, unless, as one expert told me, that the AI just has a really sick sense of humor, in which case maybe that's exactly what it would do. No, the risk is more the idea that you develop something called artificial general intelligence, which is essentially an AI that can think like a human being, but is able to grow, evolve, learn incredibly faster. And if that's possible, then the ability of that AI would certainly get out of control of human hands very quickly. If you think of why are we human beings sort of the top species on this planet? That's because we're smarter, not because we are stronger, not because we're faster, because we're smarter. So if we were to lose that position to something else, that's much smarter than us, much faster than us, thinking wise, we would be no longer top. We would be potentially in the same position that, say, gorillas or other endangered primates are today. We would be at the mercy of another intelligence, which is not, based off what we've done to other species on this planet, not a great place to be, I'd say.
It wouldn't even know that it's doing us harm. It doesn't even know it exists, and it could still do that.
Exactly. The idea is potentially it could just be, an AI essentially is, it's very good at following its objective. It's very good at figuring out an answer to whatever it's been tasked with doing. So, these researchers sort of suggest ways in which it could get kind of perverted. So, a famous example, again, from Nick Bostrom is you may have heard of this, the Paperclip Factory.
Yeah.
Right, where, you program an AI, artificial general intelligence, to make as many paperclips as possible, and then it proceeds to turn the entire universe into paperclips. And that's meant to be purposely absurd, but it does kind of get at the sort of sorcerer's apprentice sort of way of thinking, where this thing would essentially have limitless power. If you think of intelligence as the ability to carry out your objective, if you are super intelligent, you are super powered, and you want to be careful what you essentially point that intelligence at. And that could happen, again, as you point out, without really achieving any level of consciousness as we understand it. It doesn't have to mean that super intelligence and consciousness as human beings understand it go together. They may be totally separate, actually.
I met Steve Ferrecci from IBM, who made Watson, at a dinner party at Peter Thiel's house in New York one time, and so it was right after Watson had won Jeopardy. So I asked him, "Does Watson know he won Jeopardy? I mean, was he like totally excited? Like, I beat Ken Jennings, the greatest Jeopardy champion of all time? Yeah, of course, no. He doesn't even know he's playing Jeopardy. He doesn't even know. Doesn't even know what a game is.
Just following out the programming. He's just doing the analysis and just doing it faster, really.
Right. Yeah. So, Steve Pinker makes the point in Enlightenment Now that it's somewhat self-contradictory in that here you have an AI that's so intelligent it could do what you just described, or it could do whatever its task is, and yet it's so dumb it doesn't know that it's going to cause the extinction of the programmer or the whole system that would bring its own end about. Maybe the analogy is this: I drive a Tesla. And I'm on the verge of getting this, the total self-driving mode. I have the hardware, so we're just waiting for the software to see how it goes. And let's say I punch in, take me to LAX, the shortest route possible, and it does so, and it goes up on sidewalks and plows through pedestrians and so on because that's the shortest way possible. Of course, it's not going to do that, right? It's not going to be, because how long would Elon Musk's company last? Right. With regulators saying you can't kill people when you're driving your car, right? I mean, so
you just put your finger on one of the most complicated problems around AI, which is self-driving cars. Actually, as an example, like how do you? Okay, obviously you can program the car. Don't go on sidewalks. Okay, don't do this. Don't do that. But how far down do you have to get before it gets very difficult? A famous example is, you probably heard of the trolley problem. Yeah. Okay, do you go at one side? Do you go at the other? You have to make ethical choices at some point.
Right.
The AI is not capable of doing that, so it's up to us, which is fine, except when you really think about all the guardrails you'd have to put into a super intelligent AI, it gets mind-blowing very quickly. We human beings have been sort of arguing about what's right, what's ethical with each other for thousands of years. So the idea now that some computer programmer is going to be able to just figure out those answers and then somehow put that in the AI is concerning. I think it's very unlikely. I mean, Max Tegmark, who's at the Future of Life Institute, basically says, like, to get this right, all you have to do is solve all the philosophical problems.
Ever.
That seems challenging, to say the least. And even something like self-driving cars is going to present a lot of issues around that. And we've seen, like, that's a good example of how this is not moving as fast as it seemed to be. I think a lot of people thought, Elon Musk included, we'd have real self-driving cars pretty quickly. And now it's looking just a lot more complicated than we thought. The real world is a difficult place to really to really be in. And it's a lot harder to program an AI that knows how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, at the moment, I would not trust it on surface streets when there's any kind of cross traffic or people or, it's really great on the freeways of LA, for example. You just get in the left lane and it regulates exactly how far it is away from the other cars in the lane and so on. Change lanes, no problem. I mean, you could really just tune out. But he's about to shift to the next mode where it'll get off the freeway and it can recognize at the bottom there's a stop sign, it's a green light or a red light. I'm not sure how they can do that. That'll be interesting to see if that works.
That would work. I mean, that would worry me because on one hand, I understand Elon's point that he often makes when you look at the sheer number of human beings that are killed in auto accidents right now. It's the leading violent cause of death really around the world. And almost certainly, even not great self-driving cars would be better drivers than most human beings who are distracted, who are sometimes drunk, who are just sometimes bad drivers. At the same time, we need trust in it. Like we know how human beings act. We know sort of how they drive. We know how to deal with them as pedestrians. We can understand that. We don't yet know how it is to interact with machines in that way. And the other concern is if you program something incorrectly, let's say in your self-driving car, it's that update goes out to all the Teslas, all the cars, that metastasizes that error. One bad human being, one bad human driver can kill a few people. A poorly programmed AI car that goes off to a lot of cars can kill a lot of people. And that's sort of the way that mistakes or problems in AI can really, ripple out in a way that doesn't quite work with sort of analog human beings.
Or worse, you have a hacker that hacks into
exactly.
it.
Yeah, you open up an entirely new,
and he makes all the Teslas on the road right now. Sharp left turn, bam! You'd
Sure.
have 10,000 accidents in 1 minute.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's a recipe for chaos, or a very good action movie, possibly.
When I was super naive about this, when I first got my first Tesla in 2015, one of my computer friends was giving me that scenario. I said, how would somebody take over my steering wheel? He says, because you're online. I said, I'm not online. Yes, you are. The map. You have a map, right? I go, yeah. He goes, you're online. Somebody can take over your car.
Right.
I don't know how realistic that is, but in terms of AI, I'm more worried about a bad actor hacking into the nuke systems or the electrical grid or the automobile self-driving system or something like that. It seems like a combination of human evil and AI. Not that AI would become evil. It doesn't even know what that would mean. But that somebody who does have that characteristic could hack it and then do something like that.
I think that's absolutely the right way to look at it. Because one thing, we don't know if superintelligence or artificial general intelligence is even achievable. It's something where it might not be. It might be that intelligence as we understand it has a biological component that just can't be replicated by us, at least, in a machine. But AI is powerful enough, even within its narrow uses, to really magnify other risks. And that's why we're very concerned with if it gets integrated into weapon system, the idea of sort of autonomous or semi-autonomous weapons, very concerning, or the idea that, a hacker can exploit a very networked world and create far more chaos than would have been possible, 50 years ago, for instance.
Yeah. Do you have an opinion on how we would know if we achieved artificial general intelligence? I mean, what's the criteria?
The criteria. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not really sure there is. It's not like like life where it has to reproduce and have certain other traits that are common to all life. I assume it would be something that is capable of generalizing its intelligence. I mean, what's not possible right now is you can have incredibly powerful AI, but that's narrow. Okay, something like DeepMind and its AlphaGo chess and game playing system, better than any human being has ever been or ever will be in these games.
Right.
And did so within like days of training, just by training itself, just by playing over and over again. However, as you point out, not only AlphaGo doesn't even know it's playing chess. It doesn't have any consciousness. If you set the room it with playing on fire, it wouldn't respond in any meaningful way, which even the most basic form of life knows to move away from harm. So I think what you would see is evidence that AI is able to sort of generalize what it can learn in one area, use it in another, and really, in some ways, at least at the start, begin to act in ways that seem more human-like, that seem more the way that we would act. And then if it's what's called a fast takeoff, which is what has people particularly concerned, it would get much, much faster, much, much quicker, much, much smarter very quickly. So you're looking at something that's more like a nuclear chain reaction than a student getting smarter in college, for instance.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings up that issue of the problem of other minds. How do I know that I'm not the only sentient being on Earth and all the rest of you are just zombies?
That is true.
Well,
I don't know the answer to that one.
Well, my answer is the Copernican principle, is that I'm not special. And I have the same neural wiring that you have, so very likely you have the same inner experiences that I have. So you're sentient, I'm sentient, and so on. But
that's interesting, because by that same principle, it kind of, to my mind, sort of raises the possibility that you could create truly intelligent AI. Because again, if we human beings are not terribly special in terms of having evolved intelligence, then maybe it wouldn't be that difficult. Maybe it's not that impossible to see it happen in other forms and other fashions as well.
Yeah. Is Data a human, a person?
Yeah, exactly.
But he's played by an actor, so he's crossed the uncanny valley and
exactly.
It just seems totally human. But it's hard to see where that would happen. It's a little bit like trying to pinpoint Ray Kurzweil on what he means by the singularity. Something really, really, really big is going to happen. But what exactly does that mean? The doubling every 12 months, every 6 months, every 2 days, and the doubling of what? Software and hardware, or anyway, it's. But clearly,
I think it means he'll be immortal. I think that's really what. Right. If he can somehow live, but even then, it's like, all right, let's imagine you're able to upload your mind. Again, how would you know that's you?
You wouldn't.
How would
Well,
any of us know?
This is
Would
my
you
problem
really? I
with
don't
it.
know.
This is my
Yeah.
problem with it, because the current scenario is that you would have your connectome scanned,
Mhm.
and upon your death or just upon your death or something, then you're dead, and then you upload it and turn it on in the cloud or wherever.
Mhm.
But what if we did it and while you're still alive, we have a sophisticated fMRI a brain scanner, and we scan your brain, we get the whole connectome, we upload the file into the cloud and turn it on, and you're still alive sitting right there.
Mhm.
Now, which is the real you? And of course, you're sitting there going, no, I'm me, but the copy
Right.
doesn't know that. The copy
Right.
says, no, I'm the real,
Sure.
Bryan Walsh, and so on. So there's two Bryan Walshes, and then or four or whatever, And how many Captain Kirks are there now that he's been beamed to all these different planets? And is it a copy and paste or whatever? Anyway, so but that's a little bit of a sidebar, but it's kind
That's
of
some pretty mind blowing. Yeah, that really gets that gets pretty crazy pretty quickly, because then you imagine a world where, well, I could make many copies. Let's make tons of Einsteins. Let's put them all to work doing various things, and it gets very Black Mirror-ish.
I don't know if you ever saw that. There's a documentary about Ray Kurzweil called Transcendent Man.
Oh, okay.
And it's really good. It's well worth watching. But he's kind of a dark figure. He talks about him wanting to live forever and how positive he is about human thought and science and technology. But he's very focused on death. And the film follows him around. He's got a whole basement of his house dedicated to his father. His father died at the age of 51. So and the father was gone a lot, so he didn't really know him. He wants to resurrect his father. I mean, Freud would love this story.
Right. Well, I mean, it's maybe this is just the sort of our modern way of dealing with mortality, which has always been, it's always fired philosophical, religious thought. We're sort of post-religion to a large extent. We're, in some ways post-philosophy. So instead, we look to science to give us an answer to that question, and it really can't yet, and maybe it never will.
Yeah, I think we're not even remotely close to that. I keep telling people, eat, drink, and be merry, because the end is not.
Certainly have a better time while you're doing it.
All right, let's cover volcanoes and asteroids. So we've been talking about human-caused extinction events. These are these are possibly human preventive causes, but they're natural.
Exactly. Asteroids are the one that sort of, I think it's the one you tend to associate with the end of the world, in part because, there's something very cinematic about an asteroid coming from space. It's coming at you, it's destroying everything. And of course, it's the guilty party behind the most famous mass extinction of all time, the destruction of the dinosaurs. Yeah. But what's great about asteroids actually is we can do something about that. As you pointed out, it's something we can actually halt, which makes it very different than most of the other risks covered in this book. We have a space program that is actively searching for those asteroids. It's been very successful at finding almost all of the large ones, getting better and better at finding the smaller ones. And so it's very unlikely that we'd be caught off guard by a very large asteroid, something along the scale that could threaten civilization. So that's good. And then secondarily, we actually have the ability theoretically to deflect them. If we had one coming our way, there are a number of possible methods that we suspect would work that could keep us out of harm's way, which is pretty great. One could be simply ramming something, a spacecraft into an asteroid to kind of slow it down a bit, because what you want is, the term deflect makes it sound like you're knocking them out of the way like a Patriot missile or something like that. But really what you want to do is either slow them down or speed them up, because it's the asteroid and the Earth have two orbital paths. They're kind of merging like two cars on a highway. Just like a highway, someone has to give ground. So if you slow down the asteroid, then it'll just miss the Earth. So you can do that, via direct means. You can do it via sort of a gravity tractor that would pull it out of the way, possibly. You could use nuclear weapons. It's a bit like Armageddon. That was a joke of a movie, but the idea of actually drilling down, putting the weapons in the asteroid, you get a lot more destructive power that way, and that can kind of knock it off its trajectory as well.
Remember in the 90s when Sagan was writing about this, the quip was there's more people working at a single McDonald's that are searching for these near-Earth asteroids. I think that's changed now, right? There's more funding for it.
Yeah. I mean, we actually have, we have NASA has a planetary defense office with a planetary defense officer that kind of coordinates a lot of these efforts. You have academic institutions like the Catalina Sky Survey, which is connected to the University of Arizona, which I had a chance to visit during my reporting, that is responsible for finding about half the NEO's near-Earth objects that we've found so far. You have a few other ones. There's a possibility we'll put a telescope in space that would be dedicated to this, which would be really great. Actually, that would help a lot when it comes to sort of catching some of those ones that have caught us off guard. And then you have people actually sort of beginning to experiment with, okay, how do we deflect it? That said, we're only spending about 60 million, I think, a year on this. I think we could definitely stand to spend considerably more, actually go out there, do a mission, try to deflect an asteroid just to see how it works. So in the event that, we discovered one was actually coming our way, we at least had a dry run under our belts before, we actually had to save the world.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about this is until Gene Shoemaker came along in the, say, 60s and 70s, it was still not understood by everybody that all those craters on the moon are impact craters. I mean, it was still a debatable point. Like, what do those represent? Volcanoes? Or what?
It's all much more recent than you suspect. I mean, even you're sending astronauts to the moon, and we're only beginning to understand what these rocks could do to us. It was only about 1980, of course, that you had actually that theory finally formed of what had done away with the dinosaurs. So it's really much more recent than I think we often think it is.
Yeah. Yeah, some historians blame that on the sort of replacement of catastrophism by uniformitarianism in geology. That biblical catastrophism held the day for so long that when Charles Lyell and Darwin and these geologists came along and said, no, it's this uniform process, slow grinding, and that held sway until maybe the 70s or 80s, and then the Walter Alvarez hypothesis in the 90s pretty much took hold. When they find the Chicxulub Crater, and that was 2000 something.
I think it was a little after 2000.
Yeah, so pretty recent. I mean, just think about it. When you look at the moon, that's what the Earth would look like if we didn't have an atmosphere that that eroded away all those impact craters. Or
the moon itself is a product of a major asteroid impact. That's what was left over.
Or you go to Meteor Crater in Arizona, because it's a desert.
Oh, absolutely, I did.
Yeah, you've been there.
It's quite amazing. Yeah, it's quite really just to actually stand there and see it.
It's another thing that's always been curious to me. I think I've got this figured out now, but assuming that asteroids are coming in from all different directions on the globe, the impacts are always round, like they came straight down. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson explained to me, no, they come in this way, and at the last minute, they sort of go down like this, and then they explode in the atmosphere. They don't actually hit the ground. I don't know how much of this you've talked to people about.
A little bit. It's like an airburst. It's actually similar to a nuclear weapon, and that's why that actually increases the destructive power. That's why nukes, they don't explode on impact. They explode above the ground. You get a lot more power that way.
Right. Yeah. So, and Tunguska was the most recent one of major size. That's 1908. And then there was the one you also wrote about, and that was maybe just 2 or 3 years ago.
2013,
in Russia,
I think.
2013 in Russia.
Yeah, Chelyabinsk.
That was captured.
And that was another... Yeah, that was another airburst. I mean, you actually see that blow up in the air. It doesn't actually make it all the way to the ground.
Right. So if you go rushing there to see if you can dig up the meteorite, it's not anywhere. It's everywhere.
You're not going to see it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was you that talked about imagining Tunguska happening like over New York City or Moscow or something like that. I mean,
that would have been a city killer. I mean, you're looking at millions and millions of people who would have been killed by that. Now, the good news, of course, is like New York or any city is a very small target compared to the entire surface of the planet, so it's pretty unlikely it'll get hit. But that said, there's some argument to be that if Tunguska had just hit, I think a few hours earlier, the rotation of the Earth would have meant it would have hit St. Petersburg or nearby. So that shows how, these things can happen, actually, and given enough time, they will.
Okay, killer volcanoes. What can we do?
Killer volcanoes.
Other than move?
There's not a whole lot you can do about killer volcanoes, unfortunately. There's actually one NASA scientist who sort of come up with a theory about how you could essentially pump vast amounts of water into the Yellowstone caldera, the sort of supervolcano below Yellowstone, and cool it down literally over the course of thousands of years. Almost sort of turn it into a geothermal plant. That said, it's not super likely to take place. Other than that, we don't really have any ability to stop one. We can monitor them. I mean, we actually have a Yellowstone volcano observatory that keeps an eye on seismic activity or anything like that might tell us that, okay, this is going to happen very soon, get prepared in some way. The best thing we can really do is monitor them and then research alternative foods that could be raised in the event you have a massive eruption that essentially blocks out the sun for a number of years, causes vast global cooling, destroys agriculture. You'll need some other means of raising food. So, the last chapter in the book sort of deals with things you can do to handle that. That's also true for an asteroid impact. It's true for nuclear winter as well. So that's the best you can do, actually, is just try to get ready and try to prepare for how you would deal with a sort of post global cooling kind of catastrophe like that one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And aliens. Why does everybody think extraterrestrials are going to be like colonizing bellicose European, warriors?
Well, Carl Sagan didn't think that, right?
Yeah,
Carl Sagan
right.
thought that they'd all be evolved, peaceful people, and they would
Right.
teach us how to be, better human beings. Maybe that might be the case. I think we know. Here's what I would say. In the very unlikely event that intelligence exists and can physically come to our planet, they would be technologically so much greater than we are that forget it. There's no, if they had hostile intentions, or even unhostile intentions, if their very presence would be so overwhelming, it's hard to imagine how we would continue. But the bigger concern around aliens really is whether they exist at all. And
Right.
this has become a subject for existential risk experts. They're worried if you don't see evidence of life out there, and we're looking at a vast universe, we're increasingly finding exoplanets that should be able to foster life. That makes you wonder, is life much more vulnerable than we thought? Perhaps it's just very hard for it to evolve. Maybe that might be the case. Or maybe something happens. Maybe you're hit by a cosmic catastrophe like the kind we sort of outlined in the book. Or maybe there's something about intelligent life that once it gets to a certain level of technological capability, it seems to destroy itself.
Right.
That could be the case as well. And so what I think really worries people is if they begin to see lots of evidence of sort of basic life. So that will tell you that life can exist, it can get there. Maybe it can evolve to intelligence, or maybe that intelligence destroys itself. So that's what we're really concerned about when we look to the skies, look to the stars to see what our future might be, because, the other parts of the universe are far older than we are. There's been much more time for them to evolve, to potentially spread out to the stars. So if we don't see them, that tells us something at the very least. We don't quite know yet, but something.
My answer to that is they're probably out there. It's mostly empty space. We just haven't encountered them yet. They haven't gotten here.
That's the argument SETI will tell you. Seth, they'll say basically it's a. Yeah, I'm sure you did. It's like a huge.
Seth is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he has that funny line. It's like, he told me, like, you're backing out your driveway. You don't see any antelope. That doesn't mean there are no antelope. Right, it just means maybe there's no antelope around your driveway.
That's right. Well, they have to be optimistic, or else why would they bother doing what they're doing? And I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. It's a long shot, but the discovery would be spectacular. I think
it's a long shot that's getting, they're making progress all the time. You have a lot more going on now than you did 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is pretty exciting.
I haven't talked to them in a few years. How's their funding after Paul Allen died? And I think some of that got pulled, right?
Some of it got pulled. I think it's a bit of a struggle. You're seeing sort of other sort of organizations like Breakthrough Listen that are achieving more, or out of, I think, Berkeley's program on that. I think that's where a lot of that's happening right now. It's less the sort of classic SETI and more some of the new sort of work of some philanthropists like Yuri Milner, trying out sort of new AI tools, which are very exciting, can go through data much faster. Obviously, building new telescopes that you can see further as well. So, at some point, though, if we continually don't find anything and we're looking as hard as we are, we do have to wonder whether that might be the answer, actually, just possibly.
That's right. Milner proposed that postage-sized spacecraft that would have a huge light sail that we would laser beam toward the Alpha Centauri system and get there in 20 years or something like that. Yeah. I don't know if they're still talking about doing that for real.
I don't think it's sort of on the books. I'm not sure how realistic it is at this point. And that's something I'd kind of want the whole planet to maybe have a voice in. Like, are we really going to send an interstellar probe? What should that say? That's the big question, actually.
Yeah. Like the METI people versus the SETI people,
Exactly.
Should we send that message out there? My friend Jared Diamond wrote a famous essay, and I think it was 96 or so, that, we should keep our mouths shut. Because his argument was similar to what Hawking made years later, which is, look what happens when an advanced civilization encounters a less advanced civilization in the history of Earth. Not good.
No, it wouldn't. And no one would know that better than him, really.
That's right. But they wouldn't even have to be evil. They could have contaminant bacteria or viruses or something like that.
Yeah.
Or be so advanced they don't even know that they're destroying us. I mean, this would be
exactly. I mean, again, like, look at again what we've done to other species on this planet. Usually, it's not because we're directly hostile and trying to hunt them to extinction. Usually, we just sort of don't notice them, or we sort of need their space and some of their food, and so we just take it and oh well.
Yeah, like an anthill. So what?
Exactly.
They're all over the place. Just mow it down. Yeah. To me, it's one of the great questions, simply because it sort of touches on those religious issues of are we alone and what's the meaning of the cosmos if we are or aren't or whatever. The L in the Drake equation to me was the key one. How long does a communicating civilization last? Now, Jill Tarter and I had a little debate about this because she claimed it's the length of civilization period. So for us, it's maybe 10,000 years. But to me, you have to have a political unit that's willing to fund a spacefaring program or a listening program or whatever. Without that, and L in the history of civilization is about 400 years. That is, a nation state comes and goes about every 2 or 3, 4 centuries or so on average. So that's not very long to make contact with somebody else.
I took that to mean literally broadcasting. I thought that really meant, at what point do you start sending signals out to the cosmos that could potentially be found by anyone else? In which case you're talking about a century maybe?
Yeah, century. Right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we covered all the existential risks. Your last chapter, survival. So what do we do? The day after. I love that subtitle. This reminded me, actually, I had just read Tara Westover's book, Educated. I don't know if you've read this yet.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I mean, but just for all the great stories in there, what it's like to be raised by end timers, doomsayers, preppers. Oh my God, it's just insane. But that's the power of belief. If you really believe it's coming, this is the kind of stuff you probably should do.
Right. Well, I mean, I think to deal with the kind of events we're talking about here, it's very different than the sort of prepper survivalist perspective that you see with a lot of Americans, really, religious or not. You're not going to survive a major asteroid strike or a supervolcano eruption or a nuclear winter by just going off into the hills with your machine guns and your supplies. You're going to eventually run out of food like everyone else. So what you need is human beings actually come together, not the sort of social disillusion we see in movies like, or TV shows like The Walking Dead or books like The Road, but actually an ability to come together and deal with this as a species, both in terms of what we can prepare to do by researching, like I said, those alternative foods and refuges potentially even, but also just having a sort of a working social system that actually understands the importance of survival. It can't be individual, which is a problem for America because we're not generally great at that. We tend to be individualistic, but it's really going to be the societies and the cultures that are able to pull together that would survive something like this, I think.
Yeah, Japan is more communal than the United States, and within weeks after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the electricity's back on, the water's running, they're rebuilding their societies. You would never know if you went there even 20 years ago. You would never know, except they left that one church. As a reminder, same thing in some cities in Germany, they leave like one bombed out church, but you would never know that, that we, bombed the crap out of all their cities in World War II. The humans are pretty resilient. Yeah. We're pretty resilient.
They are. I mean, that's what we learned really. And hopefully we'd be resilient even in, if the worst of the worst days actually do come.
Yeah. So, so let's look at the end, right? So what are some of the other issues that, sort of wrapping up, that you learned in researching all this?
I think just lastly, one thing that really, technology is a big part of this risk. Both the technologies we can use to protect ourselves from natural risks like volcanoes or asteroids, and also the technologies that we're creating that threaten us, like AI, like I think obviously what's causing climate change, like nuclear war. So to me, it's some people say we need to pull back from tech. We need to move slower. We need to sort of be more sustainable. And I can see that, but ultimately I think, we need to move faster, do so in a wise way. But ultimately we need to innovate our ways around these kind of challenges, like something like climate change. I'm just very skeptical that, human beings will voluntarily decide to make the sacrifices needed with current technology to really avoid dangerous climate change. So what we need to do is figure out ways around that the way we always have. We've always sort of figured out technological shortcuts, and some people look at that as a bad thing. To me, that's makes human beings human beings. So it might be something like investing heavily in figuring out a way to get carbon out of the atmosphere. So you can continue your fairly energy intensive life and do so in a way that doesn't endanger the future. So I think that's what we need, really. I think if we accept that, really invest in it in a smart way, we stand a better chance of survival than if we, either ignore these risks, obviously, or somehow pretend that we're going to voluntarily give up the kind of world we have now. That just doesn't seem realistic to me.
That doesn't. No, I like that study a couple of weeks ago about planting trees. That trees are a great carbon capture technology that evolution created. And but I mean, it's a lot. It would be like something like 20% more trees than we have now. It's, I don't know, a trillion more trees or something like that. But it's doable.
It's doable, but of course it would, like anything else, it will come with its own issues. That's the nature of things. Like there's never a solution. There's never sort of a grand final solution to what we're doing. We innovate one answer, it tends to produce a new problem. Like we created the ability to artificial nitrogen fertilizer, solved a huge problem we had in terms of fertilization and actually finding food to feed a growing planet, has created all kinds of problems that we deal with now. And we're going to continue to have to do that. AI will create problems. We'll need to deal with those. Those will probably create new problems, so forth and so on. That's the nature of being a human being, I think.
Some of them are better than others, though. I like that.
Some are, yeah.
That idea of spraying in the upper atmosphere particulate matter that would reflect sunlight away, so it caused global cooling. What could go wrong there?
Yeah, that's last of last resort. I'd say. Better to figure out a way to take it out of the atmosphere in the first place than to have to create something that much of a technological workaround.
Here it seems like it's touching on human nature. I mean, what will motivate people to cooperate and actually do something when it's not immediate, like climate change. We got to do something in the next 12 years, as AOC says, or whatever it is. Maybe 50 years, something. But it's the kind of thing that it's not going to happen tomorrow. So why should I worry about it? Well, here's a bunch of reasons that are motivating. You can make a lot of money. You can make a lot of money.
Or you could figure out a way to not have to focus in the future. Like figure out a way where you can create a change that will have an impact. Now, removing carbon from the atmosphere would do that. If you reduce carbon emissions via shifting to renewable energy and so forth, you'll see an impact, but that impact will be spread out over the future. If you take it out right now, you begin to change the climate in the same way that taking sulfur dioxide or other conventional pollutants reduces smog right now. It's a lot easier to get people motivated to clean up their air that they can see. That they can see that change on a day-to-day basis, then try to get them to make a difference in their lives now that will impact decades into the future.
Yep. Brian, that's a great place to end. Thanks for writing such a great book and for coming on the show, and congratulations on it. What are you working on next after you're done with your book tour?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I've got a few, I've always been interested in food, actually, and sort of some of the science and technology around food. So I might look into that, but honestly, I'm sort of looking around to see what the next idea should be.
Oh my God, that would be a great topic, because I'm so conflicted about this. I mean, I had Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz on the podcast, and they're telling me eat meat, eat butter, eat bacon and eggs. It's all great. And then I have like my friend, the CEO of Whole Foods, John Mackey. Total vegan, and he makes all these arguments. No, meat's the worst thing you can eat. And it's like, I really don't know what the answer is.
Right. I don't either.
that could take you a few years to research all that.
I think it's going to take some time, and it'll all be wrong within 5 years.
That's right.
That's the nature of nutritional studies. They're constantly being overthrown.
Right. Well, in the meantime, enjoy your book tour for End Times.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming on the show. Talk to you later.
All right.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.